1944, the Clyde Estuary in Scotland. Shipyard workers lower two enormous gun turrets onto the hull of a battleship that has not yet been launched. The turrets are not new. Built in 1915, they were removed from their original ships in the 1920s and had sat in storage at Rosyth for nearly 2 decades. The hull beneath them is HMS Vanguard, the most powerful battleship Britain ever built, the most modern warship in the Royal Navy, and the last battleship any nation on Earth ever laid down. The weapons going into her are older than most of the men fitting them. Critics called it a scandal. Naval journalists asked why the Admiralty was mounting antique guns on a new ship when every other modern battleship carried purpose-built weapons. The Admiralty's answer was bureaucratic. The gun's own answer, delivered across 2 world wars of service before they ever reached Vanguard's decks, was something else entirely. The problem behind Vanguard emerged in 1940. The fall of France stripped Britain of Allied battleships in the Atlantic just as Germany commissioned Bismarck and Tirpitz, the largest and most powerful battleships in European waters. Japan was building the Yamato class, the heaviest warships ever constructed. Italy had modernized its fleet with fast new ships capable of threatening the Mediterranean convoys that Britain's Middle Eastern strategy depended on. The Royal Navy's battle fleet was aging. The Queen Elizabeth class, commissioned in 1915 and 1916, had already fought 1 world war and was carrying the weight of another. The King George V class was entering service slowly, hampered by mechanical trouble in its quadruple turrets. Something new was needed, large, fast, and heavily armed. In 1941, the Admiralty ordered HMS Vanguard. Understanding why the gun choice mattered means understanding what the British 15-inch Mark I actually was, because on paper it looked like the worst possible candidate for a new flagship's main armament. Designed in 1912 and rushed into production before a single prototype had been tested, it was Winston Churchill's calculated gamble against the clock, built straight from the drawing board to save the year a prototype would have cost. Its shell dated from 1915 in original form. The turrets pulled from storage had been built for the battlecruisers Courageous and Glorious, ships from Admiral Fisher's controversial 1916 program, converted to carriers in the 1920s with their gun turrets stripped out and shelved at Rosyth for the entire interwar period, while the world rebuilt its navies around them. By every conventional measure, the 15-inch Mark I was finished. The critics were certain of it. They were measuring the wrong things. Each gun fired a shell weighing 1,938 pounds in its improved streamlined form. Heavier than Germany's 38-centimeter shell on Bismarck, heavier than anything Italy's 15-inch guns threw, and heavier even than the 16-inch shells of HMS Nelson and Rodney, ships introduced specifically to supersede it. Muzzle velocity was moderate, 2,458 feet per second on standard charge, 2,640 on supercharge. That moderation was deliberate. The engineers understood something every rival navy's designers later forgot. High velocity destroys barrels. The 15-inch Mark I achieved roughly 335 full-charge equivalent rounds per barrel, nearly double Bismarck's guns at 180 to 210 rounds, and more than triple Italy's Littorio-class guns at 120 to 140. The weapon critics called obsolete outlasted its younger rivals by a margin no specification sheet could capture, because barrel life never appeared in the naval press. It appeared in the maintenance logs of ships trying to fight a war. At 30 degrees of elevation, reached through 1930s turret modifications. The gun's improved shell had a maximum range near 32,000 yards, just under 18 nautical miles. That put it ahead of Bismarck's 38-centimeter gun at 38,880 yards, achieved with a lighter shell and a cost in barrel life that made sustained fire tactically risky for German gunners, who had to count every round against the danger of wearing out their weapons mid-battle. Italy's 15-inch gun reached the longest range of any comparable weapon, over 46,000 yards, through extreme velocity, and paid for it with chronic dispersion problems and barrel lives, so short the guns were nearly disposable. Britain traded maximum range for accuracy and durability. At Calabria in July 1940, hitting a moving target at 26,000 yards, a range no other battleship had ever fired accurately at, that trade proved its worth. The turrets that went aboard Vanguard weren't simply the 1916 originals bolted into a new hull. The 1944 to 1946 reconstruction was thorough enough that recycled understates it. The original Courageous and Glorious turrets, limited to 20 degrees, had given a range of roughly 24,000 yards. The 1930s modernizations applied to sister ships raised that to 30 degrees and added nearly 8,000 yards. For Vanguard's turrets, the Admiralty went further still. Remote power control replaced the original manual hydraulics, letting the turrets train and elevate from the director tower with a precision the 1915 installation never had. New 15-foot rangefinders gave each turret independent ranging at a standard of optical accuracy that hadn't existed decades earlier. Electrical fire control, tied the turrets directly to the Admiralty Fire Control Table, Mark X, the most advanced gunnery computer in the fleet, a refinement of the same system that had guided Warspite's guns at Calabria but sharpened by 2 more years of wartime experience. Shell hoists were redesigned for reliability at sea. Cordite handling was upgraded to the safety standards adopted after the flash fires that destroyed Indefatigable and Queen Mary at Jutland in 1916. The turrets that emerged from Rosyth in 1946 shared their mechanical ancestry with 1915, but in fire control, remote operation, safety, and elevation they were weapons of the 1940s, wearing older housings. In 1941, the obvious choice for Vanguard would have been the 14-inch Mark VII guns fitted to the King George V class, Britain's most modern naval rifle, then in production. That class had been built to Washington and London treaty limits, which capped main armament at 14 inches until 1937. Its quadruple turrets had worried the Admiralty almost from the day the class entered service. HMS Prince of Wales suffered a catastrophic turret jam during her fight with Bismarck in May 1941, cutting her effective broadside by a quarter at the worst possible moment. 4 guns sharing 1 barbette, 2 guns sharing 1 slide, created interdependencies twin turrets simply didn't have. A failure in one loading cycle often disabled its neighbor. The 15-inch Mark I's twin-gun turrets let each gun operate independently. At Cape Matapan in March 1941, Warspite fired 40 15-inch rounds in roughly 10 minutes across all 4 turrets, without a single reported stoppage. At a moment when any breakdown would have let the Italian cruisers escape a battle that instead became their annihilation. The 14-inch shell itself weighed 1,590 pounds against the 15-inch shell's 1,938, a 348-pound gap, roughly a whole 5-inch shell's weight. The heavier shell carried more energy to long-range targets, held more explosive filling, and its gun eroded more slowly, though the 14-inch gun's more conservative velocity kept that gap smaller than Italy's case. Maintenance records still favored the older weapon. A 1935 internal study, declassified after the war, had proposed arming the King George V class with 9 15-inch guns and triple turrets instead of 10 14-inch guns. Treaty compliance and production schedules killed the idea. The officers who wrote it already understood what Vanguard's guns would later prove. The older weapon was the better one by the standards that decide battles. At Jutland on May 31, 1916, the 4 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships of the 5th Battle Squadron, each carrying 8 15-inch Mark I guns in the same 4 twin-turret pattern Vanguard would carry 3 decades later, engaged German battlecruisers out to 19,500 yards, beyond the German guns' effective reach, and helped cripple the battlecruiser Seydlitz early in the fight. HMS Warspite, her steering jammed, circled twice directly in front of the German battle line, absorbed 15 or more heavy hits, and survived with her guns still firing. At Calabria in July 1940, a single 15-inch shell from Warspite struck the Italian flagship Giulio Cesare at 26,000 yards, the longest confirmed hit ever scored by one moving battleship on another. At Cape Matapan in March 1941, Warspite, Valiant, and Barham caught the Italian cruisers Zara and Fiume at 3,000 yards in darkness and destroyed both in minutes. At Normandy in June 1944, the same guns reached 8 miles inland to break up German armor that field artillery couldn't touch and aircraft couldn't reliably find. The weapon Churchill gambled into existence in 1912 was still the Royal Navy's most effective heavy gun in 1944, 32 years after the drawings left the Vickers office. Gunnery officers who moved between King George V-class ships and the older Queen Elizabeths noted repeatedly that the 15-inch twin turrets ran more reliably under sustained fire, cleared faster after a misfire, and rarely propagated a failure from one gun to its partner. Artificers reported that the older hydraulic systems, properly maintained, held up better than their age suggested because the original design carried generous engineering margins that later, weight-constrained designs couldn't match. The Admiralty's own wartime gunnery reviews found the 15-inch installations produced proportionally fewer stoppages in combat than the newer 14-inch quadruples. Critics had read the production date and concluded the gun was obsolete. The men who fought with it reached the opposite conclusion, for reasons the critics never examined. HMS Vanguard was commissioned on May 12, 1946. Too late for the war she was built to fight. Her 4 twin 15-inch turrets, with their revised elevation, remote power control, and updated fire control, sat on the fastest and most heavily armored battleship Britain had ever built. 30.75 knots on trial, a 14-inch belt over her machinery, deck armor thicker than any earlier British standard. She could outrun almost any battleship she might have met, and outrange nearly all of them. She served as fleet flagship through the late 1940s and 1950s, carried King George VI and Queen Elizabeth on the 1947 Royal Tour of South Africa, and remained the Royal Navy's most powerful surface ship until guided missiles made battleships irrelevant. Not because anything had beaten her guns, but because aircraft and missiles could strike beyond the horizon a 32,000-yard gun could never reach. She was sold for scrap in 1960, the last battleship the Royal Navy ever operated.